Why the Buddha didn't teach the Four Noble Truths first. For many of us, the first thing we learn about Buddhism is the Four Noble Truths. What's ironic is that the Buddha usually wouldn't start with the Four Noble Truths, especially when he was teaching lay people. He'd first give an introduction called the graduated discourse. In many cases, after hearing the discourse, his listeners were ready for the Four Noble Truths. Really ready in the sense that once they understood them and actually experienced them, they gained their first taste of awakening. What was important was the content of the graduated discourse and the qualities of mind that they brought as they listened to it. Approaching the Four Noble Truths. The qualities were 5. They start with respect for the teacher, respect for the Dhamma, and respect for themselves. In other words, being open to hearing what the teacher had to say, trying to see the value of what he was saying, and also having a strong sense that they were capable of following the teaching. The canon tells of a wide variety of people who listened to the graduated discourse and gained their first taste of awakening, from kings down to the hired killers. In the case of the hired killers, these were people who had been hired to kill the Buddha himself. But the Buddha managed to get them to put down their weapons and listen to the Dhamma. Unfortunately, we don't have a record of what he said for these different graduated discourses. He probably tailored them to his audience. It'd have been really interesting to hear what he had to say to the killers. But they must have been impressed by his presence, impressed by his lack of fear in the face of them. In fact, they were afraid of him, so they listened with respect. He was able to get them convinced that they too could benefit from following the teachings. They too were capable of putting these things into practice. The other 2 qualities that you're supposed to bring as you listen to the Dhamma are appropriate attention and singleness of mind. Appropriate attention is when you ask the right questions. How does this teaching relate to how I'm suffering? How I can put an end to suffering? And you're really focused. The term for singleness of mind, cittass'ekaggata, is sometimes translated as one-pointedness of mind, so one-pointed that in some cases people interpret it as meaning you can't even sense your body or anything else around you. Of course, that wouldn't work for a Dhamma talk. What the term really means is the mind is gathered together around one thing. Eka 1. Agga, gathering place. The mind is gathered solely around the talk. You give it your full attention. But with appropriate attention, you're not only listening to the talk, you're also taking it in and seeing how it applies to what's going on in your mind right now. Those are the attitudes you bring. As to the talk itself, it starts with qualities of the heart. You're not being asked to figure out some theory. The Buddha starts by teaching that generosity is a good thing. This was a controversial issue at that time. There were some teachers who said that generosity didn't mean anything. Whatever you did was influenced by the stars or by other forces beyond your control. So generosity was meaningless. The Buddha is basically here saying that generosity is meaningful, and it gives good results. The same with the principle of virtue, which is the second topic. By abstaining from harm, there are good results. Whether he actually explained the principle of karma while he discussed these topics, we don't know. But the way he discussed them definitely shows that your actions are things you choose and they do make a difference. So pay careful attention to what you're doing. Then the Buddha teaches the rewards of generosity and virtue in the sensual levels of heaven. None of this is really beyond anyone's ability to understand. But then he turned the tables. He said that those sensual rewards in heaven, even though they may be very great, have their drawbacks. In fact, he talked about how sensuality, which means your fascination with thinking about sensual pleasures, not only has drawbacks, but it's also degrading. You're lowering the quality of your mind by pursuing sensual pleasures. And you're setting yourself up for a fall. When the divas end their lifespan, they come falling back down. If they've been really heedless, they go way down. The purpose of all this is to get the listener to be inclined to find another source of pleasure, another source of happiness aside from sensuality. Then the Buddha said you learn how to see renunciation as rest. Renunciation here doesn't mean simply giving up things. It means looking for an alternative pleasure, the pleasure of jhāna, the pleasure of concentration. So once he had his listeners inclined to want that kind of pleasure, that kind of happiness, to see it as a good thing, then he taught them the four noble truths, suffering or stress which should be comprehended, its cause, three kinds of craving which should be abandoned, the cessation of suffering which comes from the abandoning of craving, that should be realized, and then the path that allows you to abandon craving, the noble eightfold path that's to be developed. There were cases in which people listening actually practiced what the Buddha taught as he was teaching, and they actually saw it. This is the suffering. This is the cause. This is the cessation. This is the path. This. He's talking about a direct experience. It's not that you agree that the Buddha thinks nicely, thinks reasonably. His words are meant to have an impact on you. They're meant to have an effect. They're meant to make you do things as you listen. As you do the path, if you get it right, and these fortunate people got it right the first time, then you gain a taste of the cessation. When the five aggregates, having been comprehended, are abandoned together with the craving, the aggregates as they function in suffering, the aggregates as they function in getting the mind into concentration, those get abandoned, then you find that there's an intense happiness that's not dependent on any conditions at all. This is why the Buddha uses the image of the path. He calls craving the cause of suffering something that arises together with it. But the path is not the cause of the cessation. It leads you to the end of suffering, but what you experience after that is not caused by the path. After all, it's unfabricated. It isn't caused by anything at all. Having seen that, you come back. The experience has entirely changed your sense of what's possible. Because there are no aggregates in that state of consciousness, you're not going to identify with the aggregates anymore, saying that they're me or mine. There still will be a lingering sense of self around them, but if someone were to ask you, are they really you? The answer is no. You saw that what you've learned came through your own actions, so you're going to have to be very careful. You realize that it was through your own stupidity that you didn't see this dimension before, and the stupidity lay in acting in unskillful ways. So your adherence to the 5 precepts from now on is going to be solid. And finally, of course, there's no doubt about the Buddha and his awakening. You see inside yourself that what he said is true. There is a dimension where there is no suffering, and you gained it through your own efforts. This has a huge impact on the mind. You're seeing something you never saw before. So the teaching is not there just for you to agree that, yeah, the Buddha's right. That's not what he wanted. That was just the beginning. The important thing is that you take what he had to say that was right and you put it to use. These teachings are meant to be used as tools. They're meant not only to describe things, but also to perform, inducing you to do certain things to get on the right path. This is why when Ajahn Lee talks about the different qualities of mind that you bring to mindfulness, practice mindfulness, alertness, ardency. The wisdom lies in the ardency, in the actual doing of the duties, because it's only then that the teachings can have an effect. This is what we're aiming at as we practice taking the teachings, seeing how they apply to this questions of why am I suffering? How am I suffering? What exactly is my suffering? And how can I put an end to it? And being really focused on what you're doing. If you bring that attitude, that's when you're wise and you listen to the teachings in the wisest way. If you listen to them simply to argue or to spin out theories, there's nothing really wise about that. You're skirting around the real issue. It's what you do with the teachings that matters. As you may notice, there's an element of reflection here. When the Buddha has you listen to his teachings, you're meant to look inside and see how his teachings refer to what you're doing right now. That element of reflection carries on throughout the practice from the beginning to the end. That's why, when the Buddha introduced his son to the teachings, the image he used was of a mirror. You're not just thinking about, this is how the mind works in general. You actually look into how your mind's working right now. What is it doing, and is it skillful? If you really want to see it, you have to get it as quiet as possible. Otherwise, we stir around. That's a pun in Thai. The word for a person is kon. The word for stirring is kon. A lot of people are constantly stirred like a jar of water that has some mud at the bottom. As long as we keep stirring it, no matter how nicely we stir it or how cleverly we are in stirring it, it still keeps dispersing the mud throughout the water. If you want to see things, you have to get the mind as really still as possible. That's seeing renunciation as rest. When the mind has found this rest inside, then it's going to see itself, or at least it has a chance to see itself. This is why you have to bring in appropriate attention to ask the right questions about what's going on inside. What am I doing that's causing suffering? What can I do to stop all the questions that are worth answering come from those two? So try to get your mind still right now. That's what this hour is for. Once things inside have settled down, ask yourself, what am I doing that's adding any unnecessary stress here? As you get the mind into concentration, sometimes you find that you're doing a lot of things to get it into concentration because you've got to make sure it doesn't go here, doesn't go there. It's like a mother hen looking after a lot of little chicks trying to gather them in. But as things settle down, then there's less that you have to do. The activity of talking to yourself about the breath reaches a point where it's unnecessary, so you drop it. You reflect on the fact that I'm doing this and it's not necessary. Drop it. You find that as the mind stays really solidly still, it begins to shed different activities. And you see that because you notice that certain activities add a little extra stress to the quietness of the mind. The important thing is seeing that they're unnecessary. As long as they're necessary, in other words, if you drop them and the mind loses its concentration, you've got to do them. But there will come a point when the mind gets more solid and you can drop them in a secure way. So as you listen to the Dhamma, take the Dhamma in. The Thai Ajahns talk about this again and again, *opanayiko. Open your heart, bring it in. After all, that's where the Dhamma came from to begin with. The Buddha didn't have a lot of text to study. Everything he taught came from within his heart, and mind came from his ability to observe his own heart-mind. If you're going to follow him and gain awakening, you have to learn to observe yours as well. The Four Noble Truths, the central core of everything the Buddha taught. On at least 2 occasions, the Buddha said that all he taught was dukkha and the ending of dukkha. MN 22, SN 22, 86. This means that if you want to understand his teachings, dukkha is a good word to know. Its primary meaning is simple enough, pain, but it covers all levels of pain, from acute physical suffering and mental anguish to subtle levels of stress and very refined, even blissful states of mind. Unfortunately, there's no single English word that can encompass all these levels of intensity. Fortunately, though, the fact that we have separate words for pain, suffering, and stress helps to clear up some of the difficulties that the Buddha faced, given that his language had only one word to cover all these things. In the course of this book, I will usually translate dukkha as suffering, but occasionally I'll use pain or stress where they seem to fit better into the context. The main point to remember, though, is that dukkha is the primary focus of everything the Buddha taught. If you're interested in solving the problem of suffering, then his Dhamma, or teaching, is where to look. If you're interested in other issues, you can look somewhere else. In his first talk, the Buddha taught that the path to the end of suffering started with right view concerning 4 noble truths: suffering, its origination, its cessation, and the path to its cessation. Here too, it's good to look at the words the Buddha used for truth and noble, Sakka and Ariya. The early Buddhist text defined Sakka as whatever is undeceptive and doesn't turn out to be other than what it seems. The way the text used this word shows that a truth can mean either 1. A fact as a reality in and of itself, or 2. An accurate statement about that reality. This double meaning is important to keep in mind for 2 reasons. The first is that it's directly related to the solution of the problem of suffering. In the search for an end to suffering, you're looking for accurate statements that describe how to reach the reality of suffering's end. The second reason is that the Buddha made statements about truth that sometimes seem contradictory if you assume that truth can be only a reality or only a statement. But once you realize that the word has these 2 meanings, the seeming contradictions disappear. And not only that, understanding the Buddha's insight into the relationship between pain as a reality and the words inspired by that reality helps you understand how best to make use of the 4 truths in practice. The 4 Noble Truths contain all skillful teachings. The Buddha called these truths Ariya, noble, for at least 4 reasons. The first is that they inform a path of practice that leads not just to the temporary ending of individual pains, but to a deathless dimension where all pain and suffering is transcended for good. Only a search that seeks the deathless, he said, can be rightly called noble. MN 26. Any search aimed at a lesser happiness was, in his eyes, not noble at all because that lesser happiness would inevitably lead to disappointment. The noble truths are noble because they show the way to the noblest of goals, a happiness that would never disappoint. The second way in which the truths are noble has to do with the fact that the Pali word for noble also means universal. These are truths that apply to all beings everywhere, regardless of gender, race, nationality, or cultural background. They're true even for beings on other levels of the cosmos, because they focus on the structure of how suffering is caused in any mind. Because these truths are universal in serving the noblest of goals, they're also noble in the sense that they're preeminent. On the one hand, they're preeminent in the world at large in pointing to the unique way to the best goal possible, deathless happiness. All other truths are subordinate to them in this regard. On the other hand, they're preeminent specifically in their relation to the other truths the Buddha taught. Even though he learned many things in the course of his awakening, he realized that all the lessons with the potential to lead others to awakening were contained within these 4 truths, SN 5631. So they form the context in which all the other truths he taught have to be understood. An image from the Pali Canon, the earliest extant record of his teachings, states that just as the footprint of the elephant can contain all the footprints of all land animals, the 4 Noble Truths contain all skillful teachings, MN 28. And finally, the truths are noble because they're ennobling. They require you to adopt a noble attitude toward your suffering. To begin with, this means admitting the suffering inherent in the way your mind normally clings and craves. To adopt the truths is to step back from your likes and dislikes and to acknowledge that they're precisely the things causing you to suffer. At the same time, the truths also ask you to become noble in taking responsibility for ending your sufferings in a way that harms no one. In so doing, they put power in your hands and show you how to use that power responsibly. They open the possibility of finding happiness with true dignity. When the Buddha explained the 4 Noble Truths in his first talk, he noted that each truth carried a duty. Suffering was to be comprehended, its origination abandoned, its cessation realized, and the path to its cessation developed. Once he had fully completed these 4 duties, he stated, he knew that he was fully awakened. He was now released from suffering of every sort, SN 56:11. What this means is that the truths are not just interesting facts, they're a call to action. Because the Four Noble Truths form the context for all the Buddha's other teachings, they're like sorting boxes to determine what that call to action means in any given instance. Once you know which box a particular teaching is in, then you know what to do with it. Is it a teaching that helps you comprehend suffering? Or is it one that helps to abandon its cause? Only when you know what to do with a teaching can you reap its full benefits. But even though the Four Noble Truths form the context for understanding and applying all of the Buddha's other teachings, the truths themselves fall into the larger context of his teachings on truth and the normal human response to pain, MN 95 and 663. Once we understand these larger contexts, we can better make use of the Four Noble Truths, in particular to grasp why the Buddha formulated the truths in the way he did. It's good to know how he understood the mind's normal reaction to pain, both what was normally wrong with that reaction and what was potentially useful toward providing an opening for going beyond pain and suffering altogether. To grasp the role he had in mind for the truths, it also helps to know how he saw the social dimension of telling the truth and learning the truth in the context of the search to find a reality that truly ended the reality of pain. This is the main purpose of the podcast series, to explain the Four Noble Truths, 1. In and of themselves, 2. As the context for understanding the Buddha's other teachings, and 3. In the light of the larger context provided by the Buddha's understanding of the mind's natural response to pain, and how that response shapes the desire for truth. I hope that understanding the words of the Four Noble Truths in this way will provoke insights leading to the deathless reality to which they point. The desire for truth. The search for truths about pain starts with a truth in the form of a reality, the experience of pain itself. As the Buddha explains it, there are two natural responses to this reality, bewilderment and a search, in 663. The bewilderment comes from not knowing why the pain is happening. This is especially true for infants experiencing pain. But because the causes for pain can be so complex, unpredictable, and seemingly beyond our control, this bewilderment can last throughout life. The search comes both because we're bewildered and because we desire another reality. We want the pain to stop. It's in the psychological and social space defined by these responses that the Buddha formulates his teachings on truths in general and on the Four Noble Truths in particular. The social space is defined by relationships, your relationships with other people, your relationship to the words you use to communicate with those people, the relationship between those words and reality, and the relationships among the realities you want your social interactions to influence. These relations start within the context of a duality, the difference between pain and the cessation of pain. Because this is a duality of realities, the truths that take you to the second reality will have to acknowledge this difference. The cessation of pain differs from pain and is preferable to the pain. Any teaching that denies this duality and the way we evaluate it won't satisfy your desires or needs. Within this duality, the Buddha articulates the search for the cessation of pain in these terms. Who knows a way or two to the cessation of this pain? In 663. The way this question is articulated carries many implications. 3 in particular stand out. 1. The fact that we're looking for knowledge from other people brings in the personal dimension of our desire for the truth about pain. We interact with others because we're looking for someone who has A. true knowledge about the reality of ways to end the pain, and B. the compassion to convey that knowledge to us. This is the context in which we begin to look for truth in the form of words. Words that convey genuine knowledge, spoken by a person who truly knows the relevant realities and wants us to know them too. It's important to note that our desire for personal relationships is strongly shaped by the fact of our suffering. The role of pain and suffering in shaping this desire is so basic and strong that it sometimes makes you wonder, if there were no such thing as pain and suffering, if our experience were already totally blissful, would we be interested in personal relationships at all? For these reasons, truth in this social dimension is a matter of true relationships within two further dualities. First, assuming a duality between reality and words, we're looking for a true relationship between the reality of the ending of pain on the one hand and the words pointing to that reality on the other. The statements about that reality have to correspond to what that reality actually is. It's because of this duality that the Buddha used the word truth with a dual meaning, the truth of the reality and the truth of the words describing that reality. Second, assuming a duality between ourselves and the people we hope will teach us the way to the reality of the ending of suffering, we want a true personal relationship in which the person teaching us not only knows true words about the ending of suffering, but also has enough genuine compassion to teach us those words in a way that we can understand them and put them to use. We, in turn, will have to do our best to give the teachings contained in those words a genuine try. Only when a relationship is genuine on both sides like this can it be called true. 2. The fact that we desire the end of the pain is what shapes our attitude toward the words we're taught about pain. We're not interested in true words for their own sake. We want true words that help guide us to the reality we want. In this way, the words have to serve our desires. They prove their truth by genuinely leading us to a reality where those desires are satisfied. 3. The question behind this search divides reality into 4 parts, based on 2 dualities, one of which we've already noted: the difference between the reality of pain and the reality of the cessation of pain. One side of this duality, pain, is not desired, while the other side, the cessation of pain, is. The other duality relates to the fact when you think of a way that accomplishes an aim, you're assuming 2 types of real events: causes and effects. The way you're looking for is the cause. The end of suffering is the effect. These 2 dualities taken together divide reality with regard to the problem of pain into 4 parts: the undesired effect, pain; the unskillful cause leading to the undesired effect, the desired effect, the cessation of pain; and the skillful cause leading to the desired effect. Mental suffering is the Buddha's primary focus. In teaching the 4 Noble Truths, the Buddha takes all these considerations into account. To begin with, it's because of the double duality in the last point that the Noble Truths are 4 rather than 3 or 5. The Buddha offers to teach us these 4 truths in words that correspond to the reality of how pain can be understood and brought to an end, and he promises to be truthful in conveying his knowledge of that reality. He teaches these words not as ends in themselves, but as means to an end, the reality of the ending of suffering. As we will see, he identified true Dhamma as what passes the test in actually bringing that end about. The fact that he devoted his entire teaching to these issues is what makes the Dhamma unique and radical in its focus. But even though the question, who knows a way or two to the cessation of this pain, sketches out the basic framework for how the Buddha's teaching on the 4 Noble Truths is supposed to function, still, it leaves many issues unclear. The way the Buddha clarified these issues is what makes the Dhamma unique and radical in its particulars. If we separate the question into 3 parts, we can see where it's unclear. Who knows a way or two? What kind of way are you looking for? Do you want the other person to take the pain away for you, or are you willing to do the work yourself? To the cessation, are you looking for a total ending of all pain, or will you be content to settle just for the ending of this particular pain? Of this pain? What kind of pain are you talking about? Physical, mental, both? In presenting the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha sharpens these three parts of the question, at the same time answering the question as a whole. Let's look at these 3 points in reverse order. We start with the nature of pain and suffering. In the first Noble Truth, the Buddha lists many events that count as suffering. The list starts with a combination of physically and mentally painful events: birth, aging, and death, sorrow, lamentation, physical pain, distress and despair, association with the unbeloved, separation from the loved, not getting what is wanted. These are all forms of suffering familiar to everyone. But when the Buddha summarizes what all these events have in common and makes them stressful, his analysis doesn't sound familiar at all. The common thread in all these forms of suffering, he says, is the act of clinging to the 5 aggregates of form, feeling, perception, fabrication, and consciousness. But here it's enough to note that the suffering of clinging is primarily mental. Without clinging, none of the other events in the list, even though they might be physically painful, can cause suffering to the mind. So mental suffering is the Buddha's primary focus when he talks about the ending of suffering. However, he states in the second Noble Truth that the cause of clinging is any craving that leads to further becoming, a self-identity in a world of experience. But here we can simply note that the craving leading to becoming not only leads to mental suffering in the present moment, but can also cause you to act in ways that will lead to both mental suffering and physical suffering in the future. When the mind is freed from craving, it opens to an unconditioned dimension in which there is no birth, aging, or death at all. This means that a fully awakened person, after the death of his or her last body, is freed not only from mental suffering, but also from any and all physical pain. Because this deathless dimension lies outside of space and time, this freedom is total, once and for all. This connects with the second point. People, if asked for their most heartfelt desire around pain, would most likely respond that they'd want total freedom from all pain. That's our most primal desire about pain. We'd never like to experience it ever again. But day to day, life has led us to believe that that's an unrealistic goal, as we go from one pain to the next and then the next. So we tend to lower our sights, abandoning our primal desire and trying to content ourselves with efforts to end individual pains as they occur. The Buddha, however, felt that life would be worthwhile only if he could hold to the heart's primal desire for a total cessation of pain and do his best to find it. The main message of his first talk was that he had succeeded in his search. This is the point of his third Noble Truth. The craving that causes suffering can be ended without leaving a trace, which is why the total end of suffering is possible. As for the way to the end of pain and suffering, even though we might prefer that someone else do the work for us, the Buddha found that that was impossible. We suffer because we haven't completed the duties with regard to the Four Noble Truths, which means that we suffer from our own lack of skill. No one else can make us skillful. Other people, like the Buddha, can point out the way to develop our skill, but we ourselves have to follow that way if we want to stop suffering. DHP 276. This way is described by the fourth Noble Truth. It consists of 3 basic mental skills: virtue, concentration, and discernment, divided into a total of 8 factors. Discernment is divided into the factors of right view and right resolve, virtue into the factors of right speech, right action, and right livelihood, concentration into the factors of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Virtue, concentration, and discernment. These factors will be discussed in detail in future podcasts, but here we can point out three important features of this path. A. The factors of the path are all fabricated or assembled from the same five aggregates that, when clung to, constitute suffering. Right view, for instance, is composed of perceptions and thought fabrications, the labels the mind applies to things and the thoughts it assembles from those labels. Right concentration makes use of all five aggregates. Also, an important part of right effort is the desire to master skillful action. This means that the path must be used strategically. The factors are developed until they have served their purpose. Then they're abandoned along with the cause of suffering. The Buddha's image, which we'll have reason to cite frequently in the course of this book, is that the path is like a raft. You're currently standing on the unsafe shore of a river while safety lies on the far shore. There's no bridge to the other side and no boat, no Nibbana yacht to ferry you across. So you build a raft from the branches and twigs you find on this shore, hold on to it as you swim across the river, and then, when you reach the safety of the far shore, you put it aside to go on your way. MN 22, SN 35, 197. A more modern image would be of a load of bricks you're carrying on your shoulders. To suffer is to refuse to put the bricks down. To follow the path is to take the bricks off your shoulders and use them to build a runway. When the runway is done, you can take off and fly. B. Right view is one of two factors that the Buddha highlights in his discussions of the path. To have right view is to see things in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Because these truths are part of the path, this means that we will have to put them aside when we reach the reality on the other side. This connects to the point we made above, that the Four Noble Truths are true because they work. The technical term is that they're instrumental. They're meant to be used for a certain task aimed at a certain goal, like a carpenter's tools for building furniture, and then put aside when the task is done. Because they act directly or indirectly as guides to action, they contain inherent value judgments as to what's worth knowing for the sake of actions worth doing. C. The other factor that the Buddha often highlights is right concentration. This factor he compares to food in that it gives you the strength to follow the path, N763. The levels of right concentration are defined by their feeling tone, levels of rapture or refreshment, pleasure, and equanimity. The fact that these feeling tones can be consciously fostered means that they can provide temporary relief from suffering as you follow the path. The path doesn't save all its rewards for the end. Still, it requires work. Even though the Four Noble Truths respond to your desire for a total end to suffering, they don't pander to your desire that the way there be easy or that it will follow your preconceived notions. This means that you need to be convinced that the path is at least worth a try. As the Buddha notes, the repeated reality of suffering and stress forces you to place conviction in at least some way to end suffering. For you to place that conviction in the Buddha's analysis of suffering and the way to its end, you need to develop conviction in the person teaching the way and in the words explaining the way itself, to the point where you're willing to give the way a genuine try. These three issues define the social dimension of the Four Noble Truths. In the next episodes, we'll discuss how the Dhamma analyses these three issues with the aim of arriving at the reality beyond the social dimension, where the desire for the end of suffering is fully met. The Four Noble Truths. The Buddha, a true teacher. Before the Buddha gave his first talk, he had to establish the right relationship with his audience, a group of 5 monks, MV1 6.1031. He needed to convince them of the possibility that he knew what he was talking about, that he would tell them the truth, and that they would benefit from hearing it. In other words, he had to convince them that he was knowledgeable, truthful, and compassionate, the qualities anyone would look for in a teacher offering to give instruction on the way to end suffering. Now, the Buddha already had some history with the 5 monks. They had been his attendants during a 6-year period when he subjected himself to extreme austerities, almost starving himself to death in his search for the deathless. When he realized that if he continued with those austerities he would die without having achieved his goal, he began eating again in moderation. The 5 monks, seeing this, decided that he had given up on his search. Disgusted, they left. MN 36. As it so happened, the Buddha hadn't given up at all. He had actually gained his first insight into one of the factors of the actual path to the deathless, the practice of right concentration. But with his body so emaciated, he couldn't attain that concentration. That was why he had started eating again. Still, in their eyes, he had slacked off. So, when after gaining awakening he sought them out to teach them, he had to convince them that it would be worth their while to listen to him and follow his instructions. At first, they resisted. When he told them that he was now awakened, that he had attained the deathless, and that he could teach them how they too could follow the way to the deathless, they rejected his claims. How could he have found the way to the deathless after slacking off? 3 times he asserted his claims, which, in the culture then, was a sign of his earnestness, but 3 times they rejected them. He then reminded them of what they knew of his truthfulness. Had he ever made a claim like this before? No. So the group of 5 were willing to listen. The Buddha taught them the 4 noble truths along with the duties appropriate to each, and at the end of the talk, one of the 5 gained his first glimpse of the deathless. The Buddha now had a witness to confirm his claims. Shortly thereafter, he was able to help all 5 to fully attain the goal. This was the first instance of a pattern that was repeated again and again in the first years of the Buddha's teaching career. He had to convince his listeners of his knowledge, his truthfulness, and his compassion. When they could see that he was the kind of teacher they were looking for in their search to end suffering, they were willing to put his teachings into practice and gain the desired results, either fully awakening to the end of suffering or gaining a glimpse of the goal and knowing that eventually they would arrive there. The Buddha, a true teacher. In taking on the role of teacher, the Buddha presented himself as what he called an admirable friend. To listen to him and follow his instructions was to enter into an admirable friendship with him. He later defined this sort of friendship in a way that could apply to other reliable teachers as well, in 854. Simply put, you enter into an admirable friendship first by looking for a person whose behavior embodies 4 qualities: conviction, virtue, generosity, and discernment, and who encourages other people to develop those qualities as well. Then you establish a relationship where you try to emulate those qualities in your own behavior too. This relationship, the Buddha said, was the most important external factor in awakening to the end of suffering, ITI 17. Conviction here means conviction in the Buddha's awakening, and particularly in the principle of karma, that the Buddha discovered in the course of his awakening, that your experience of pleasure and pain comes from your own actions, either present or past. Virtue means abstaining from 5 forms of harm: killing living beings, stealing, engaging in illicit sex, telling lies, and taking intoxicants. Generosity refers to being generous not only with your material possessions, but also with your time, energy, and knowledge. Discernment means understanding the principles of cause and effect as they can be mastered to put an end to suffering and stress. Of these 4 qualities, conviction and discernment relate to the teacher's knowledge, virtue to the teacher's truthfulness and compassion, and generosity to the teacher's compassion as well. In addition to defining admirable friendship, the Buddha set up a monastic order to train his disciples to be admirable friends to themselves and to others. Around this order, he established a culture of training and apprenticeship that would encourage the practice of admirable friendships to last for many generations. Several aspects of that training were particularly aimed at ensuring that the values of knowledge, truthfulness, and compassion would be fostered in the culture he left behind, a culture that has lasted to the present day. In terms of knowledge, he trained his students in cross-questioning. If there was anything in the teaching they didn't understand, they were encouraged to ask for clarification and to keep asking until they understood well enough to put the teachings into practice. The Buddha contrasted this style of teaching with what he called training in bombast, in which the teacher teaches using flowery and lofty words with no clear meaning, and the students are discouraged from asking what, precisely, those words might mean. And 246. Because training in cross-questioning is aimed at the student's understanding, it's also training in compassion. The act of teaching should serve, not the glory or popularity of the teacher, but the student's ability to benefit from it. In terms of truthfulness, the rules by which the Buddhist monks and nuns live encourage them to be truthful in 3 areas. A. To begin with, they should be truthful in observing their own actions. The rules were designed so that if a monk broke a rule, the severity of the offense often depended on the intention behind the act and on the perceptions that informed it. For instance, taking something you perceive to be yours carries no penalty, whereas taking, with the intent to steal, something you correctly perceive as belonging to someone else can get you permanently evicted from the order. The importance of these mental factors in determining an offense forces the monks to be observant not only of their physical actions, but also of the intentions and perceptions behind their actions. It also sensitizes them to the fact that their perceptions can often be wrong. If they take their training seriously, they have to check their perceptions again and again to make sure they're accurate. This aspect of truthfulness can be called truth in observation. B. When a monk is accused of an offense, he should truthfully report his actions to the monks judging the case. They're instructed not to settle the case until they're convinced that the accused is telling the truth about what he did. This aspect of truthfulness can be called truth in reporting. C. When a monk is accusing another monk of an offense, he should be truthful in citing the basis of the accusation. Is it based on what he saw, what he heard, or only what he suspected? Those judging the case have to make sure that the accuser is not exaggerating the strength of his evidence. This aspect of truthfulness can be called truth in citation. These 3 forms of truthfulness play a role, not only socially, within the monastic community, but also internally, in the way you approach the practice. Just as you look for a teacher who's truthful in these 3 ways, you should be truthful in the same 3 ways as you examine the views you bring to the practice and as you engage in training your mind. In terms of compassion, the monks and nuns are enjoined to teach the Dhamma freely and not to accept payment for a Dhamma teaching, and 5.159. The Buddha himself rejected, in very strong terms, any payment for what he taught. Sen 1.4. This is because the Dhamma is best learned when it is treated as a gift. After all, the Dhamma emphasizes the virtue of generosity as a feature of admirable friendship and as a foundation for the practice, and the best way to teach generosity is to be generous with your teaching. It's for this reason that the monks and nuns are required to live off the gifts of others for 2 main purposes. 1, they're under no pressure to teach, as their needs are met, so there is no reason for them to use the Dhamma as a means of livelihood. 2. Living off the generosity of others, they're encouraged to feel gratitude and to express that gratitude by practicing well and offering the Dhamma with a generous heart. ITI 107. Choosing the right teacher by Buddha's guidance. In the Buddha's image, there are those who are like the tongue that immediately knows the taste of the soup, and those who are like the spoon that can sit in the soup forever and never know its taste. DHP 64. This was true in the Buddha's time, and is still true now. Just because a person can claim to be a product of this culture doesn't mean that she is qualified to teach. For this reason, the Buddha also laid down standards for potential students to use in judging how well a potential teacher embodies qualities of knowledge, truthfulness, and compassion. This is to help protect you against studying with a spoon. These lessons appear in the larger context of the Buddha's analysis of the steps to be followed in awakening to the truth. MN 95. Finding a true teacher is the very first step, and the first requirement in that step is to develop the quality of truthfulness in yourself. As the Buddha noted, you can't judge another person's integrity unless you have some integrity of your own. MN 110. At the same time, you have to be observant, willing to spend time with a teacher, watching his/her behavior until you're convinced that the teacher is worthy of your trust. And 4. 192. This is why the Buddha looked for two qualities in a student: that the student be observant and not deceptive. MN 80. To be observant means that you watch carefully your own behavior and that of others. You're quick and objective in seeing your own good points and faults, as well as theirs. To be not deceptive means that you report your behavior truthfully to others without hiding any lapses in terms of your morality. In addition to looking for truthfulness in a teacher, you're also looking for someone who knows what's best for you and who really has your best interests at heart. The Buddha has no use for the idea that all teachings are just a power play, an effort to bring others under the teacher's control. Admittedly, such teachings do exist in the world, but if a teacher is showing you the correct way to totally end your suffering, how compassionate can you get? It's entirely for your benefit when the teacher, in the Buddha's words, has this attitude toward teaching. That's the purpose of discussion. That's the purpose of counsel. That's the purpose of drawing near. That's the purpose of lending ear. That is, the liberation of the mind through no clinging. And 3. 68. To find the sort of person who would want to see you liberate your mind, the Buddha suggests 3 ways to test a teacher's knowledge, truthfulness, and compassion. Spend time with the teacher who seems knowledgeable and try to measure the teacher against these 3 questions. 1. For knowledge. Does this person teach truths that would be hard for a person of greed, aversion, and delusion to know? 2. For truthfulness. Does this person have the greed, aversion, or delusion that would inspire him/her to claim knowledge that she didn't have? 3. For compassion. Does this person have the greed, aversion, or delusion that would inspire him/her to get another person to do things that would lead to that person's long-term harm or suffering? If the answer to the first of these questions is no, or the answer to either of the other 2 is yes, look for another teacher. If the answer to the first is yes and to the other 2 no, then you can go on to the next steps in awakening to the truth. Develop conviction in the teacher, draw near, and listen to the Dhamma that she has to teach. As you listen to the Dhamma, remember that you will be hearing truths expressed in words, and that those words are meant to be put into practice. The truth of words. As we have noted, the Buddha saw that every truth expressed in words is instrumental, a means to an end. This is in line with the fact that all words are fabricated by the mind and, as he himself observed, all fabrications are put together for the sake of something. They're meant to serve an aim. The Buddha chose his words so that they would serve the most beneficial aim of all, leading the listener to the reality of the end of suffering. He was once asked if he would ever say anything displeasing to others, and in the course of his answer, he explained the framework he used in deciding what was worth saying and what wasn't, MN 58. The framework boils down to 3 questions. Are these words true? Are they beneficial? Is this the right time to say something pleasing, or is it the time to say something displeasing? If something wasn't true, he wouldn't say it. If it was true but not beneficial, he wouldn't say it. Only if it was true and beneficial would he go on to the 3rd question. Given his audience and their state of mind, would it be more beneficial to express that truth in a pleasing or a displeasing way? It's easy to see how pleasing words would be beneficial. Listeners tend to be open to hearing them. As for the case of displeasing words that were beneficial, the Buddha gave an analogy. If a baby boy had put a sharp object in his mouth, then if you had compassion for the boy, you'd do everything you could to get the object out, even if it meant drawing blood. Your aim would be that he not swallow the object and do even more harm. In the same way, if the Buddha saw people behaving in ways that were harmful to themselves or to others, he would sometimes warn them sharply, both to get them to stop those harmful ways and, if there was an audience, to let the audience know that that kind of behavior definitely shouldn't be taken as an example to follow. The way the Buddha sets out his framework makes 2 important points. The first is that, as he goes through the various possible combinations of true, false, beneficial, unbeneficial, pleasing, unpleasing, there is one combination that he doesn't even consider as a possibility, that a statement could be false but beneficial. For him, only true words could be beneficial in the long term. He had no use for the idea of useful fictions. Some fictions might be beneficial in the short term, but over the long term they would end up doing harm, either in misleading the listener or in destroying the listener's trust. The second point is that the Buddha also had no use for the idea that displeasing words were necessarily harmful. People are not damaged by hearing words they don't like, especially if those words are meant to benefit them. The skill here, of course, lies in knowing the right time and place for words of that sort so that they'll actually have the desired beneficial result. What this means is that the Buddha was interested in truths as words, not for their own sake, but for how well they worked. This is why, when the canon describes the Buddha's style of teaching, it uses 4 verbs. He would not only instruct his listeners, but he would also urge, rouse, and encourage them. In other words, he wouldn't just give them information about the path to the end of suffering. He would also try to get them to follow it. In terms of the factors of the path to the end of suffering, the information was to give them right views about how to solve the problem of suffering. The urging, rousing, and encouraging was to get them to generate the desire to follow the path, the desire that lies at the heart of right resolve and right effort. After all, the point of his teaching was to get his listeners to the reality of suffering's end. Simply listening to the words wouldn't get them there. They would have to understand the words and act on them. In some cases, they did this while he was speaking. They took his lessons and used them to observe their own minds, performing the duties appropriate to the 4 noble truths and achieving one or another of the levels of awakening right then and there. This, for example, was what happened during his first talk. In other cases, the listeners would take his words and practice in line with them later, reaching the goal when they were off on their own. The 4 verbs fall into 2 categories. His words of instruction were descriptive. true to the extent that they gave an accurate picture of what should be known as to what suffering is, how it's caused, and how it can be ended. The words with which he urged, roused, and encouraged his listeners were performative, true to the extent that they inspired actions that were actually possible, based on accurate descriptions of reality, and would give the right result, the reality of the end of suffering. The Buddha's descriptive words and performative words both count as instrumental. They differ simply in that they function in different ways. The descriptive words give you a map to the end of suffering, including information useful for that purpose and omitting irrelevant details. An example would be the Buddha's detailed analyses of the Four Noble Truths. The performative words encourage you to follow the map. Examples would be his teachings that prepare your mind to accept his analysis of how to end suffering, and those that energize you to practice in line with that analysis once you've accepted it as a working hypothesis. When you arrive at the goal, you no longer have to follow the map and, aside from showing it to others for their benefit, you can put it aside. The Buddha's desire for words that work not only shaped his teaching style, it also shaped the criteria he recommended that his listeners use in determining what was true Dhamma and what wasn't. Just because words could be found in the texts claiming to come from the Buddha didn't mean that they were necessarily true Dhamma. After all, as he noted, people might remember his words wrongly. The only way his listeners could be sure that a teaching was true Dhamma would be if they were true enough to put the words to the test to see if they actually worked. Testing truth. This is one of the most interesting features of the early Buddhist texts. The Buddha knew that the tradition had to be handed down by teachers and texts. But when those texts list various true and false criteria for determining the truth, among the false criteria are the claims that something is true either because it's taught by your teacher or because it's found in a text. The true criterion is that the teaching has to be tested to see what kinds of actions it leads to and what the results of those actions are. However, this doesn't mean that people can validly test the Dhamma any way they like. The texts prescribe a method for testing the truth of a teaching, any teaching, and this method is central to the Dhamma in the same way that the scientific method is central to science. Just as a discovery counts as scientific knowledge, only if the researcher correctly follows the scientific method. Dhamma can be known as true Dhamma only if you test it in line with the Dhamma method. Like the scientific method, the Dhamma method has very clear standards for what does and doesn't count as a sufficient proof of a statement's truth. The canon lists the following reasons as insufficient proofs: N3, 66, MN 95. A teaching isn't true just because you're convinced it has to be true, just because you like it, just because it's logical, just because it's probable, just because it's consistent, either through inference or through analogies with other views you hold, just because it's been passed down by an unbroken tradition, just because it's found in Scripture, or just because it's said by a person you've taken as your teacher. A statement meeting these criteria could be true, but could also be false. The basic standard for what does count as a sufficient proof is very simple in principle. A teaching is true if, when put into practice, you can see that it yields the promised results. Of course, the very idea that you can test the truth of statements by putting them into practice and judging the results makes some basic assumptions about the nature of reality. This is true both with the scientific method and with the Dhamma method. Both methods make the following assumptions. Causal relations follow a pattern that holds true over time. In other words, causal relations are not totally chaotic, and the pattern they follow doesn't change arbitrarily from one moment to the next. If it did, a hypothesis that tested true today wouldn't necessarily hold true tomorrow. The causal pattern is not totally deterministic. You have at least some freedom to make choices in the present moment that will change situations in the present moment. In other words, your actions are not totally determined by the past. If they were, you couldn't manipulate a situation to see which manipulations had an effect on other events and which ones didn't. You couldn't conduct scientific experiments, and you couldn't try out different beliefs to see what impact they had on your actions. The mind has the power to influence events. It's not totally determined by material causes. If it were, you wouldn't be able to design an experiment to test a hypothesis, and the act of adopting a view as a hypothesis wouldn't have an effect on your physical or verbal actions. These assumptions are so basic to the Dhamma method that the Buddha, who normally wouldn't go looking for debates, actually sought out and argued with teachers whose doctrines denied them. His purpose was to show how their views were causing harm to anyone who believed in them. In his words, doctrines that denied causality or taught deterministic causality left students helpless and bewildered in the face of pain and suffering. And 362. The Dhamma method makes one extra assumption that's not necessary to the scientific method. Actions leading to long-term welfare and happiness are better than those leading to long-term harm and suffering. The Buddha saw no need to prove this assumption. He wasn't interested in teaching people who were unwilling to accept it. In the context of Dhamma practice, your ability to test a truth in practice is complicated by the fact that many of the teachings require dedicated effort over time before yielding their results. As the Buddha pointed out, you don't really know the truth of his teachings until you've had at least your first glimpse of the deathless, and that glimpse can take a while to attain. In the case of the 5 monks, this wasn't long, but for many people, it takes years of practice. In cases like that, you need good reasons to believe that your efforts to test the teachings make sense and that they're not a waste of time. Otherwise, you'll give up before completing the test. This is why the Buddha, to encourage his listeners, would use methods of persuasion that, strictly speaking, fall in the list of insufficient proofs. For example, he would frequently use logic and analogy to show how his teachings were reasonable. Still, he was careful to note that he didn't mean these statements as out-and-out proofs, and he advised his listeners to safeguard the truth, in his terms, by being very clear about why they were convinced that a particular teaching was worth testing in practice. In other words, if you believe the value of a teaching because it seemed reasonable, you should acknowledge that fact, admitting that you still didn't know that it was true. You simply have valid reasons for taking it on as a working hypothesis. Be mindful, be alert, and be ardent. As for the standards to use in measuring what counts as genuine Dhamma, the Buddha set out 2 lists. The first list gives a series of mental qualities that are synonymous with the goal. You know that a teaching is genuine Dhamma if, when put into practice, it leads to utter disenchantment, to dispassion, to cessation, to stilling, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding, and 780. This list underlines the fact that you don't really know the truth of the Dhamma until your first taste of awakening. At the same time, though, the list gives an idea of some of the mental qualities that accompany awakening. Disenchantment, for example, means that you're no longer enchanted with the causes of suffering, and so you no longer want to feed on them. Dispassion means that you no longer feel any thirst to continue creating the causes of suffering. The second list starts with 2 qualities that are synonymous with the goal, dispassion and being unfettered, but then goes on to include other qualities that are useful in taking you there. You know that a practice is in line with the Dhamma if, when you follow it, it leads to shedding conceit, to modesty, to contentment with the material requisites of life, to non-entanglement with other people, to aroused persistence, as opposed to laziness, and to being unburdensome to others in your material needs, an 853. These last 6 qualities provide you with some realities against which to measure your practice along the way, not only in terms of the qualities you develop within yourself, but also in terms of the impact that your practice has on others. Some people have argued that there are many Dhamma teachings that can't be tested in this way. Examples would include the teachings on the fact of rebirth and the role of karma in influencing rebirth, in that they don't involve actions or develop mental qualities that can be gauged in the present moment. But that argument is simply not true. Views on issues of this sort involve actions in the act of choosing to adopt them, and the results of that choice can be measured by the behavior they inspire within you here and now when you do. As the Buddha pointed out, if you adopt the view that rebirth happens and is influenced by the quality of your actions, you'll be more inclined to be consistently skillful and harmless in your actions than you would if you didn't. MN 60. Because the test for the truth of the Dhamma involves qualities you develop within yourself, it's also a test of your own truth. To be a valid judge of the Dhamma requires that you train yourself in the qualities of a reliable and truthful observer. This is why the Buddha looked for students who were honest and observant to begin with. It's also why the path of practice involves developing qualities that train your honesty and powers of observation even further. This is clear in a list of 3 qualities that are central to the practice of right mindfulness and right concentration, MN 10. Be mindful. A. To keep in mind what you've done so that you can measure the results of your actions over time, and B. To remember how to recognize skillful and unskillful qualities arising in the mind so that you know what to do with them. Be alert to know clearly what you're doing and the results you're getting from your actions. And be ardent in putting in the effort to do the practice as best you can. The Buddha notes that if you really do the practice, you'll get results whether you wish for them or not. But he also notes that right effort has to involve desire. You have to want to do it, often in the face of desires that pull in other directions. What this means in practice, as you prepare to put the Dhamma and yourself to the test, is that you need to be so sincere in your desire to put an end to suffering that you're willing to give the Dhamma a fair test. If it doesn't work, you really want to know so that, like the Buddha in his quest for the deathless, you can then look elsewhere for a better, more efficacious path. If the Dhamma does work, you also really want to know, so that you can enjoy the results that come from putting it into practice. If you focus your desire for genuine happiness in this way, you'll be in the ideal position to test how far the words of the Dhamma are actually true. The 4 Noble Truths, Step by Step to the Truth. For many people at present, the 4 Noble Truths are among the first things they learn about Buddhism. This is ironic, because the Buddha himself often found that he first had to prepare his listeners to develop the right frame of mind for properly receiving the 4 Noble Truths. After all, he wasn't concerned with teaching people about Buddhism. He was more focused on speaking to their needs, to overcome suffering, and to put them in the best frame of mind to receive and accept his teachings on the topic so that they would be willing to act on them and to reap their benefits. He did that by teaching them other topics beforehand. Only when they accepted his preliminary teachings and allowed their hearts and minds to be moved by them would they be willing to accept the 4 truths and to act on them. This is because the 4 truths point out a duality about desire that many people find hard to accept. Their common desires, the ones they tend to follow willingly and happily, are actually the causes of suffering, whereas the desires that lead to the end of suffering require training. The central role of desire in shaping the 4 Noble Truths can be seen in the similes the Buddha uses to illustrate his teachings as a whole. They're all images of people acting on desire in a skillful way. We've already noted the image of the raft. Desiring safety, you want to escape from the dangers on this shore of the river, so you put together a raft that you can hold on to as you paddle across the river to the safety of the far shore. The words of the Dhamma are instructions on how to build the raft. The practice of the Dhamma is the raft itself. Another image is that of a search. People search for objects, such as a strong bull elephant to do work or the heartwood of a tree to build something solid, and the Dhamma shows them how to find the objects they desire. Another image is that the Dhamma is your guide for how to act in battle so that you can attain a desired victory. However, the image most relevant to the Four Noble Truths is one in which the Buddha compares himself to a doctor desiring the health of his patient, and the Dhamma to medicine, ITI 100 and 10, 108. Many people over the centuries have noted how the Four Noble Truths are like a doctor's approach to a disease. The truth of suffering describes the disease's symptoms. The truth of the origination of suffering diagnoses its cause. The truth of cessation gives the prognosis that the disease can be totally cured. And the truth of the path charts out the course of treatment to bring about that cure. Given that the Four Noble Truths are so focused on the issue of desire, the Buddha saw the need to urge his listeners to understand the value of abandoning the desires he criticized as ignoble and to develop noble desires in their place. As we'll see, the first ignoble desire in his list of the causes of suffering is the craving for sensuality. Most of his listeners, though, saw this craving as their dearest friend and companion. As far as they could see, sensuality was their only avenue to escape pain, so he couldn't simply instruct his listeners about the dangers of that friend. He first had to encourage them to change their feelings of allegiance. To induce this change of heart, he had to use performative truths that would expand their imagination to see that it was both possible and advisable to develop new and more reliable inner friends. In short, he had to rouse within them the desire to adopt a nobler attitude in their search for happiness. Step by step to the truth. His means for doing this was called the step-by-step discourse, cittass'ekaggata. Interestingly enough, even though he gave this discourse many times in the course of his teaching career, the canon never gives a full script of the discourse itself. All we have is a list of the main topics it covered, MN 156. Giving, virtue, heaven, the drawbacks of sensuality, and the rewards of renunciation. One of the reasons for not recording the script may have been that the Buddha changed it on a case-by-case basis, treating these topics differently in line with his audience, and the canon tells us that that audience varied widely. Once the Buddha taught this discourse to a king and a large crowd of his subjects. At other times, he taught it to a wealthy moneylender, a rich housewife and her daughter, a poor leper, and even an archer hired to assassinate him. Given that this discourse was both descriptive and performative, it only stands to reason that a talk, say, on giving that would be persuasive to a king might not work with a poor leper. So the Buddha had to choose his words to fit his audience. Yet even though we don't have the script for this discourse, we do have detailed accounts of how he covered these individual topics on other occasions. These other accounts can give us at least a general sense of what the step-by-step discourse might have said. Topic No. 1. Giving. One of the most important points that the Buddha made about giving is that you should give where you feel inspired. When discussing the topic of giving, he focused on occasions when the gift is voluntary and not simply a matter of custom. The fact that a gift should be freely given was so important that, when designing the culture of his monastic orders, he made sure that the donor's freedom to choose where to give was always protected. For example, If people approach a monk and ask where they should give a gift, he's supposed to say, "Give wherever your gift would be well used, or would be well cared for, or would last long, or wherever your mind feels inspired." NP 30. Still, the Buddha noted that the happiness that results from giving can be greatly multiplied by approaching the act of giving as a skill. This skill has 4 dimensions: your motivation in giving, your attitude while giving, your choice of the recipients for your gift, and your choice of what gift to give. With regard to motivation, the lowest motivation is to give a gift because you expect to get a similar item back after death through the results of karma. A higher motivation, the Buddha said, is the idea that it's simply good to give. An even higher motivation is, "I'm well off. These people are not well off. It wouldn't be right for me not to give a gift to those who are not well off." A motivation higher than that is when you realize that giving a gift makes your mind happy and serene. The highest motivation is when you give not because you're expecting any return from the gift at all. Your generosity is simply an expression of the goodness of the heart and mind. And 749. So, to get the most out of the gift, you try to develop increasingly higher motivations. Although it's important to note that the highest motivation applies only to those who have reached the penultimate level of awakening. Prior to that point in the practice, it's good to focus on how the act of giving makes the mind happy and serene. That gives energy and further motivation to your practice. The second dimension in giving as a skill is your attitude while you give. You give attentively. You give with conviction that something good will come of it. You give with empathy for the person receiving the gift, and you don't have the attitude that you're simply throwing the gift away. And 148. When you give with the proper attitude, the recipient is glad to receive your gift and more inclined to use it well. As for the third dimension, the best people to whom to give, the Buddha said that it's best to give to those who are free of passion, aversion, and delusion, or to those who are practicing to overcome passion, aversion, and delusion, and 324. These are the people most likely to make best use of the gift. When you see that, you'll be happy you gave. Finally, as to the gift that's good to give, the Buddha said that you give in season. In other words, you give a gift appropriate for the time and place, and you focus on times when the recipients are especially in need. Also, you give without adversely affecting yourself or others. And 148. In other words, you don't give so much that you don't have enough to use yourself, and you don't steal the gift to give it to somebody else. It's worth noting that the Buddha never mentions the material value of a gift as a measure of the goodness it creates. He simply observes that when giving a gift, it's best to give things that are at least on a par in value with the things you yourself use. That way, you'll feel more happiness when reflecting on the gift. When you've developed giving as a skill, the act of giving makes your mind glad before you do it, bright and clear while you're doing it, and gratified after you're done, and 637. In this way, the act of giving in and of itself is a source of happiness, but it also provides further long-term results. People will find you charming, they'll admire you, you'll have a good reputation, and you'll approach assemblies of people without being ashamed. These are benefits in the present life. As for future lives, the fact that you've been generous will tend to lead to a heavenly rebirth, where you'll outshine those who weren't so generous. If you return to the human level, you'll tend to be wealthy and inclined to enjoy your wealth. And 534. Topic No. 2. Virtue. Virtue, the second topic, refers to not intentionally breaking any of the 5 precepts against killing, against stealing, against illicit sex, against telling lies, and against taking intoxicants. The Buddha notes that when you intentionally hold to these precepts in all situations, you're giving universal safety to all. In other words, no one anywhere has to fear harm from your behavior. When you give universal safety in this way, you'll have a share in that safety as well. And 839. The Buddha does note that there are times when observing the precepts may cause you to suffer loss in terms of your wealth, your health, or your relatives. For example, you may be put at a disadvantage in business dealings when you don't lie, and you may meet with situations where you and your relatives will go hungry when you don't steal. But in terms of your long-term well-being, that kind of loss is trifling compared to the loss that comes when you intentionally break these precepts. And 130. These precepts embody the principle of harmlessness. As with the act of giving, the act of holding to this principle, even when difficult, is a source of happiness in and of itself. This can be seen immediately in that it gives you a solid basis for healthy self-esteem. It also gives long-term benefits. If you conduct your life in a virtuous way, your wealth tends to be solid and lasting. You have a good reputation for being reliable. If you go to a meeting of people, you can expect that no one will have valid grounds for accusing you of misbehavior, and you die unconfused. In other words, you approach death with a clear conscience. DN 16. As for the benefits after death, being virtuous tends to lead to a heavenly rebirth. If you return to the human world, you'll be fortunate in line with each of the precepts you followed. You'll tend to have a long life. You won't lose your wealth. You won't face rivalry and revenge. You won't be falsely accused, and you won't suffer mental derangement. And 840. Topic No. 3. Heaven. Strangely, even though the Buddha frequently mentioned the possibility of a heavenly rebirth, the canon records very few descriptions of the pleasures of heaven. This may have been because the compilers of the canon were more interested in emphasizing the fact that there's a higher happiness than heaven, total liberation. All they have to say about heaven is that there are heavens of unalloyed sensual pleasure, where sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations are all exclusively pleasant. The happiness felt by the ideal king, wealthy, powerful, handsome, loving his subjects and loved by them, is only a small sliver of the happiness felt by heavenly beings. MN 129. Topic No. 4. The drawbacks of sensuality. In contrast, the canon has a lot to say about the drawbacks of sensuality. On the human plane, these drawbacks are easy to see. It's because of sensuality that people have to work, often in difficult circumstances, even though there's no guarantee that their work will yield the wealth they desire. Even if it does, they have to protect their wealth from being stolen or falling into the hands of hateful heirs, thieves, jealous rivals, or rapacious governments. It's because of sensuality that family members fight with one another, that countries wage war with one another, that people commit crimes and suffer punishments when they're caught, and that people act in ways that lead to a bad destination after death. MN 13. However, given that, in the step-by-step discourse, this topic follows on the topic of heaven, the Buddha probably focused on the drawbacks, even of sensual pleasures on the heavenly plane. On this level, the primary drawbacks are 3. 1. Sensual desires can never be fully satisfied. As the Buddha said, even if it rained gold coins or you could possess 2 mountains of gold the size of the entire Himalayan range, it still wouldn't be enough to satisfy your sensual thirsts. SN 420, DHP 186. 2. Life in heaven doesn't last forever. When the good karma that sent you there runs out, you have to leave. 3. Heavenly beings enjoying the fruits of their past, Kama tend to get careless and complacent. Rare are those who give thought to developing the goodness of their minds and actions any further. As a result, the vast majority of heavenly beings, on passing away from their heavenly realms, fall to planes lower than the human. SN 56, 102, 113. It's as if the round of rebirth were a sick joke. You practice the goodness of generosity and virtue for the sake of sensual happiness, but then that happiness corrodes your goodness and lands you back worse than you were before. Then you have to struggle to get to the human realm where you can practice goodness again and again and again. Meanwhile, the tears you've shed through your many rounds of rebirth over the death of a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, a son, a daughter, are more than the waters in all the oceans of the earth. SN 15:3. When you think in this way, you're ready to look for a way out. Topic No. 5. The rewards of renunciation. This would be when the Buddha would talk of the rewards of renunciation. Renunciation here does not mean renouncing happiness. Instead, it means finding happiness in ways that don't involve sensuality. These would include the bliss and rapture that can be found by centering the mind in right concentration, leading to the even higher bliss of total liberation. When finding happiness in these ways, you can live simply, without fear that others will be jealous of you or try to take your happiness away from you. These forms of happiness hold none of the dangers of sensuality. In particular, they never destroy your goodness. The happiness of right concentration may come and go, but the happiness of liberation never ends. When you can accept the idea that this kind of happiness would be better than sensual happiness, you're ready for the 4 noble truths that will show you how to get there. Through the way he explains these topics and the order in which he explains them, the Buddha is accomplishing 2 things. First, he touches on some basic principles of the Dhamma, at the same time putting them in their proper context. The 2 main principles are Kama and rebirth, which are the 2 basic teachings of mundane right view, the view that leads to actions that produce happiness within the round of rebirth. With his teaching on Kama, or action, the Buddha makes the point that your actions are real and have real consequences, and that those consequences follow a pattern. Skillful actions, based on a lack of greed, aversion, and delusion, lead to pleasant results. Unskillful actions to painful results. At the same time, though, the pattern of consequences is not entirely deterministic. What you experience in the present moment is not totally shaped by what you've done in the past. Regardless of your past actions, you're always free in the present moment to choose a skillful course of action. Without this freedom, you wouldn't be free to choose the path to the end of suffering, and the whole idea of the Buddha's teaching a path of practice would make no sense. This is why he emphasizes the role of motivation and attitude in his discussion of generosity and the role of intention in his discussion of virtue. It's in your choice of motivation, attitude, and intentions that the freedom available to everyone in the present moment can be found. As for rebirth, the Buddha's discussion here is limited simply to asserting that it really happens, that there are many levels on which it can happen, that life in none of the levels can be permanent, that you go up or down through these levels based on your actions, and that these facts should be taken into account when you calculate what actions to do and what actions to avoid if you want long-term happiness. This connects with the context for these teachings. The Buddha isn't interested in teaching Kama and rebirth for their own sake. His emphasis is on the role they play in the search to find a reliable happiness and to put an end to pain. In other words, he's showing how these teachings relate to the search that everyone has been engaging in ever since their first experience of pain. Who knows a way to its cessation? Also, by starting with generosity and virtue, he's giving a preliminary answer to the questions that he says lie at the beginning of discernment. What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term harm and suffering? And what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? MN 135. Here again, by defining discernment in the context of the desire for long-term happiness, the Buddha affirms the value of the search to avoid pain, and he's also making discernment an issue of value judgment, what's worth doing and what's not. As for his answer to these questions, acts of generosity lead to long-term welfare and benefit. By following the precepts, you avoid long-term harm and suffering. By touching on the principles of karma and rebirth in answering these questions, the Buddha shows why these questions are wise, in assuming that long-term happiness and pain are possible and will depend on your actions, at the same time defining how long-term really is. So the Buddha, in his step-by-step discourse, is showing that his teachings are aimed at solving, in the largest possible context, the problem of pain. Whatever he teaches, if you want to understand it, you need to know where to place it in this context. By establishing this as his context, he's not only helping you to understand his teachings, he's also helping you relate to them emotionally in the most fruitful way. In other words, he's helping you to get both your head and your heart around them. Some people, on learning about karma and rebirth, immediately think of the bad things they've done in the past and see the teachings as negative, threatening, and justifying punishment and retribution. That's why they reject them. But by introducing these teachings in the context of the search for happiness, the Buddha's showing how they make that search possible and meaningful. If you didn't have freedom of choice in the present moment, acts of generosity and virtue wouldn't reflect any especially good qualities in the heart and mind. You do these acts simply because you had to. If you and those around you were annihilated at death, then in the larger picture, nothing would be accomplished by being generous or virtuous. All efforts to look for happiness in noble ways would ultimately lead to nothing. So when the Buddha asserts that you do have freedom of choice and that your good actions will have long-term benefits, he's affirming that your noble intentions are meaningful and that when you act on them, they yield long-lasting results. These thoughts lift the heart. This connects with the second thing that the Buddha's accomplishing in his step-by-step discourse. He's establishing a relationship of admirable friendship with his listeners, at the same time fostering their inner growth. He uses performative truths in hopes of having an influence on his listeners' attitudes, both in heart and mind. But by placing that influence in the context of admirable friendship, he's showing that he's not doing it simply for the sake of power or control. He actually has his listeners' best interests at heart. He wants them to be truly happy. By starting the discourse with common, everyday activities, rather than abstract principles about the nature of reality, he's connecting with his listeners' direct experience. They've done actions in the past, and he's affirming the power of their actions to make a difference in the amount of pleasure or pain they experience. Unlike many other teachers of his time, he doesn't advocate a picture of reality that negates the power of human action. Instead, he tells his listeners that what they have seen from their own actions is true. You can make a difference by what you do, and not only a difference, a good difference. By focusing on generosity and virtue in particular, he's connecting with his listeners' experience of looking for happiness in ways that are socially mature. When you find happiness in generosity and virtue, you make the people around you happy as well. In focusing on this point, he's appealing to his listeners' nobler side, affirming that it has meaning and serves a genuine purpose. At the same time, by describing the sensual rewards of generosity and virtue, the Buddha is showing his listeners that he's no prude. He does appreciate the pleasure they've already tasted in sensuality, and he understands their desire for even more. This makes them more willing to trust him when he eventually points out the drawbacks of even the highest sensual pleasures, and on how they would benefit by raising their sights and looking for happiness in ways that put sensuality aside. When the Buddha has accomplished this task, his performative truths have performed their duty. In his own analogy, it's as if he has washed his listeners' minds in the same way that he would wash a piece of white cloth before dyeing it. They would now be ready to accept the dye of the Four Noble Truths, or